You're not.
Go ahead and get us started, Bruce.
Yes, welcome. Welcome all to the first webinar hosted by the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. Am I coming through okay? I think so. My name is Bruce Fisk, and I'm delighted to moderate today's conversation. We're calling it Annexation 101 on Israel's pending move to annex Palestinian territory. We have much to learn from our three guests joining us today from Washington, California, and Palestine. Much to learn on matters that are timely and weighty, but also confusing and controversial. Here to sort everything out are Mae Cannon, Heather Keaney, and Sam Bahour. Reverend Dr. Mae Cannon has, seems to me, lived multiple lives. In her first life, she worked for NGOs like World Vision, Compassion International, and served churches in California and Illinois. Today, she serves as Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. Her PhD in history from UC Davis focused on American Protestantism in Israel and Palestine. Her latest book, Beyond #Activism, could not be more timely. Before that, she wrote Evangelical Theologies of Liberation and Justice with Andrea Smith, and bravely edited a collection of essays titled A Land Full of God, Christian Perspectives on the Holy Land. Mae is frequently cited in media, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, Christianity Today, Leadership, Jerusalem Post, CNN. When she's not writing or speaking, Mae is networking and organizing for the cause of a durable peace in Israel and Palestine. Mae, welcome.
Thanks, Bruce. Good to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's so critical.
As are we all. Second is Dr. Heather Keaney. In her former life, Heather lived for 12 years in Cairo, Egypt, where she taught history at the American University in Cairo and became fluent in Arabic. Her PhD is from UC Santa Barbara. So Westmont College was fortunate to lure her back to Santa Barbara, where she now teaches Middle East history and co-directs study abroad semesters in Istanbul, Cairo, and Israel, Palestine. Students in Heather's classes admire her brilliance, her pedagogy, her even-handed disposition, her detailed knowledge of the Middle East. So Heather, thanks to you also for joining us. And last but not least is Sam Bahour, entrepreneur, businessman, active in Palestinian civil society, who apparently never sleeps. He's all over the internet. His analysis frequently features in world media, PBS, The Guardian, New York Times, Haaretz, Wall Street Journal, just to name a few. Sam is a gentle giant, I would say. I'm pretty sure he's the tallest man in Palestine, always full of insight and generous with his time, whether it's speaking to my students in Ramallah or speaking with us here today. So Sam, welcome to you.
Thank you, great to be here.
The Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East promotes civil conversation, not rhetorical combat. So if you have civil, non-combative questions, please use our Q&A or chat buttons on your screen as we go, and I'll do my best to direct your queries to our panel. So let's begin, shall we? Heather, are you there and able to engage? Yes, you are. Once she's unmuted. There we go.
I am unmuted.
Perfect. Heather Keaney, the current push for annexation has a historical context. The modern Israel-Palestine conflict, running at least since 1917, is sometimes called a land war. Two peoples want the same real estate. And today's annexation plan is all about real estate. The West Bank is home to nearly 3 million Palestinians and is key to a Palestinian state if one ever were to emerge. So Heather, provide some historical context for us. What changed in 1967? Talk to us as well about Jewish settlements. What are they and why are they controversial? Why do some call settlements illegal while others defend them?
So there's a lot there. I would say in terms of, I think the phrase or the framing of the conflict as one over land is helpful. I think it's also one of two peoples, the Jews and the Palestinians, both claiming national sovereignty or statehood, peoplehood on this land. I think for me, a key date, well, not just for me, for all involved, is the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 in the post-World War II and in the shadow of the Holocaust. But I think a key phrase in terms of what we're talking about today is David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of the State of Israel, when the State of Israel was declared, with the boundaries that it had at that time, that is not including the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights. David Ben-Gurion said that Israel could have wanted to be a Jewish democracy on all the land of historic Palestine, but it could only ever be two of those three things. If it wanted to be Jewish and a democracy, then it could not be on all the land, because then it would absorb more Palestinians and it would no longer be Jewish. Or if it didn't grant citizenship to those Palestinians, it would no longer be a democracy. And so Ben-Gurion advocated for being a Jewish democracy on part of the land. 1967 changed that calculus. In the War of 1967, when Israel conquered or took control of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights, it upended that calculus because it now had all the land. But as Ben-Gurion had warned, there were now millions of Palestinians, and Israel did not grant those Palestinians citizenship, compromising its democracy. Or if it did give them citizenship, compromising its Jewish character. And this continues to be the dilemma that Israel faces. And it wants to maximize land and minimize the number of Palestinian people that are in its country. And they have not found a way to square that circle. I think, so some would see 67 as this great victory for Israel over the Arab states and this gaining of territory and getting strategic depth. Others would see the victory of 67 as a catastrophe for Israel because it made it an occupying force, no longer this great experiment in democracy, no longer this great hope for the Jewish people, but again, an occupying force controlling millions of people who did not want to be controlled by them, to whom they didn't give citizenship. It made it a country of collective punishment and prisons and rule by military tribunals for many people, and that it's rotting out, some would say, Israelis included, that 67 has set in motion this rotting out of the soul of Israel. One, which is a hot debate within Israel itself. Related to that, since 67 has been this expansion of what are known as settlements. So this desire to, again, I think, treat the West Bank and Gaza as a colony, and that Israel became an empire in 67. And like with colonies, these settlements are creating communities of Israeli Jews in this occupied land, overlooking and ruling over the majority of the Palestinians, people who live there. They're illegal by international law because international law and the UN have repeatedly stated that land occupied in war is not legal and must be returned, like Iraq occupied Kuwait. And so they're regarded as illegal by international law. Those who want to say they are not illegal are those who would say that all of this land belongs to Israel, should be Israel, but the dilemma remains about what to do with the Palestinians who live right next to these settlements, in between these settlements, surrounding these settlements. And that's the dilemma that faces this annexation move as well.
Let's come back to that question of Palestinian-Israeli kind of coexistence within the West Bank. And I'll turn to Sam at this point. Sam, you moved to Palestine from the US in the 1990s in the wake of the Oslo Accords that many thought would bring peace and in a few years, 2 states to the region. You had a dream. Remind us of the optimism of the 90s and your personal connection to that. And then why did you decide to uproot your American life and return to your roots in Palestine?
Sure, thank you. Well, I mean, for me, it was less coming back with too much optimism. A lot of people came to Palestine during the period post the Oslo Accords, and I can tell you most of them have since left, mainly because they came under the assumption that peace was there. It was steps away, and they came under the impression that the occupation, if not ended, was about to end. I came with a very different context. I was very politically aware and being politically active in the States. I came as an extension of my work against the Israeli military occupation without any kind of blindness or hallucination that things had changed to the point where we can relax. And I came and put myself into an economic development frame. I was part of building the Palestine Telecommunications Company. And to me, that was economic resistance par excellence. And I learned through building that company, which today is the largest private sector company in Palestine, that Israel had and has no intention whatsoever to allow us to create a different reality on the ground. I wasn't throwing stones or missiles. I was trying to build telephone lines so people can have a service that was already available to everyone in the region. And that came under extreme pressures of the Israeli restrictions. So coming back for me, or I wasn't coming back, I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. So I relocated to Palestine. My wife, who was originally from here, did come back. And we had one child born in the States, Irene, and another girl in Palestine, Nadine. And so we built our small family here. And so my coming to Palestine was an extension of my political activism, turned and morphed into more of an economic activism, but both with the same purpose, to find a way to end this military occupation. When I got here, maybe the additional insight was we have to serve the population that's here. There's too much romanticism about the Palestinians, as if we're super people, and we're not. We're just a people who have been battered for a very long time and are in a very, very serious struggle. And those 5 million people that wake up every morning in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza have to find a job, love, get married, go to school, et cetera, and that requires jobs. So for every job I can create in Palestine, I believe that I've enacted an act of nonviolent resistance better than throwing any stone anywhere else.
Sam, you're reminding us that the occupation is not simply military with checkpoints, it's also bureaucratic, and you face challenges even on that level. Now, beginning in 2000, there's of course the Second Intifada and its violence, the Palestinian uprising, that dashed hopes for many that peace was possible. Sam Bahour, why do you think your dream and the dream of many for a state didn't materialize? You've begun to talk about that. Many would blame Palestinians for militarizing the conflict, but I suspect it's a little bit more complicated. You already suggested that the plan from the beginning was not to see 2 states. Do you want to elaborate on that?
No, let me correct that. First, yes, there has been militarization here and there, but that's funny coming from the States these days. Because yes, there's looting here and there, but is that the issue? That's actually a tangent to a very deep societal issue that has to be dealt with. And we can't create red herrings in our minds to take us elsewhere. Same thing here. And I'm a nonviolent person by design. So I don't accept any act of violence, not because I'm a Quaker, but it's because I don't think there's a military solution to this conflict. So I strategically take a conscious decision to be nonviolent. In terms of statehood, I actually give the Palestinians a lot of credit, because if we put the question you asked to Heather in a little bit of a broader context, the Charter of the United Nations, enacted in 1945, spoke against any acquisition of territory by force. It's very clear in the Charter of the United Nations, Chapter 2, 2.4 to be exact. That charter, that message that you cannot take territory by force, existed prior to the State of Israel being created by force. Existed before the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza were occupied. Even though that was the fact of the matter, the Palestinians, maybe in a very bad negotiating manner, accepted those violations of international law and entered the Oslo Accords peace process that we know, the infamous Oslo Accords process, by taking the first step, which was recognizing the state of Israel in writing, on paper, publicly. And Israel did not give an equal recognition to the state of Palestine. Instead, they recognized the PLO as the representatives of the Palestinians. It's like the US presidency going to China and recognizing the Republic of China, People's Republic of China, and China replying by saying, and we recognize that you're the head of the Republican Party, Mr. Trump. That would be laughed at. And that's the way the Palestinians entered the Oslo Accords. Even that was the case, and even the Camp David failed in reaching a solution that was acceptable to both sides, what did the Palestinians do when the Camp David peace process and the Oslo process failed? They went back to the UN, where this conflict started. And they basically said, we have failed to reach a bilateral solution. World, we're asking you, are we worthy of Palestinian statehood or not? 138 countries of the world said yes. And that upgraded us in the UN to a non-member observer state. So for me, on paper, the issue of 2 states or 1 state or 3 states is over. It's history. It's political capital spent. Palestine exists in the global community of nations. What has to be worked on today, and that's why I think we're talking and why annexation is so dangerous, is that there is a military occupation which is occupying that state of Palestine. So it's not as complicated as people would like to make it today, because Palestinians conceded all the difficult issues. Now we're just asking for the boot of Israeli occupation to get off of our necks.
Well, that history that you and Heather have provided brings us up to the present. So let me turn to Mae Cannon. And Mae, fast forward us to today. This webinar is all about annexation. What do we mean by annexation? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't like the term. He wants to, as he puts it, extend sovereignty over certain territory. Potato, perhaps. What areas might become part of Israel in July if this goes through the Knesset? And why is this a big deal? And what do you think would change on the ground for people in this region? And while you're talking, I'm going to put up a few maps to help us out here.
Sure. So before I go into explaining some of the details of annexation, I would say the posture that I'm entering into this conversation first and foremost is as a pastor. So I'm ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church. And one of the things that I want everyone here to wrestle with and to discern is I fundamentally believe that for people who self-identify as Christians or followers of Jesus, that the care and concern and equal treatment of all people, be they Palestinian or the challenges we're having here in the United States in terms of racial injustice, it's absolutely critical that we as Christians engage. And so in that regard, I believe that this is a discipleship issue, that as we seek to be faithful to our Christian faith, why should Christians care about this? Because it's an injustice, and thus I think Jesus would care about this. So in that regard, what is annexation? Annexation would be the process by which certain territories that have been deemed essentially the future territories of the Palestinian state would be become officially a part of the state of Israel. And so when Netanyahu is talking about expanded sovereignty, he's talking about the government of Israel taking over that land where it would officially become a part of the state. And it's kind of interesting because for people who work in this part of the world or work in the occupied Palestinian territories or on issues related to this conflict, many people would say there's already a de facto annexation, in many parts of the West Bank. So if you go, for example, to the Jordan Valley, which is the area that you see in kind of that orangish color along the left bank, the West Bank of the Jordan River, that Jordan Valley is a part of Area C. So the West Bank is divided into 3 different areas A, B, and C. A is under Palestinian civil and security control. B is under Palestinian civil control, but Israeli security control. And Area C is under Israeli civil and Israeli security control. And Area C already makes up 60% of that territory that you see here on that first map on the left-hand side. That's called the West Bank. And so the proposed annexation is 30% of the West Bank, or up to 30% of the West Bank, which would include settlement blocks, which are those territories of land of Jewish Israeli citizens. This is what Heather was talking about, settlements being illegal by international law. There's hundreds of thousands of settlers living in the West Bank. And so the proposal is that settlement blocks would be annexed. And there's all kinds of, different proposals as well. So this map that we see of settlements and this map that we see of proposed annexation is some of the conversation about what it could be. And I will point you back to, we said, why should Christians care about this? Another question might be, why should US citizens care about this? And a significant reason why is because our government is complicit, and our government is absolutely impeding a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So you might have heard of President Trump in the spring announced a plan that he called the Peace to Prosperity Plan that actually included the proposal for 30% of the West Bank to become a part of Israel, which is detrimental to the Palestinian people, to the populations that live there, but to the future of peace. And then I don't know, I saw the maps kind of going back and forth. Where's the map that shows us kind of the Bantustans and shows us the separation of part of the problem is not only is annexation illegal, not only is it completely not acknowledging the equal rights, the human rights of Palestinians, who are residing in the West Bank. I think that we might need to mute Heather. We're getting some echo. Thank you. In that regard, I just wanted us to look at this map in specific. You can see the different colors, areas A, B, and C that I was just talking about. You can see the Jordan Valley being a proposed part of annexation. But what's so important to understand here is that when you even look at the former Secretary of Defense of President Trump's administration, General Mattis, he said what's happening in the West Bank will absolutely become apartheid. Many people say it already is. This map shows you how that would come to be. It shows you how population centers of Palestinians living in cities like Nablus and Bethlehem and Ramallah, where our friend, I would imagine, Sam Bahour is right now. It would show how those cities would be even further disconnected than they already are if you had this annexation proceed. So I'll just pause there. That's a bit of a summary of some of what's at stake in this vote that's supposed to go before the Knesset in early July.
That's very helpful, and maybe Sam or Heather wants to chime in. I do have another question for you, Mae, but Sam, Heather, do you have anything to add?
A quick intervention. If you could, that map that was just up just now, very important map, but let's put things in historical perspective. The whole issue of areas A, B, and C were part of a Oslo interim agreement that has ended. It's history. So the United Nations, when it defined and accepted Palestine as a non-member observer state, this entire map, plus Gaza, is the state of Palestine. So the other map that would be useful is to put up the Trump vision. He didn't even call it a plan, he called it a vision, something very vague. And it divides things even further than just that 30%. Last thing I'll say is, yes, what is being discussed now in terms of annexation is 30% of the West Bank, but Trump's vision envisions Israel having 100% control from the river to the sea. Inside that agreement, it talks about Israeli approval before anything can happen and Israeli security approval forever. So ultimately, Israel is the sovereign power from the river to the sea, regardless of the different chunks and islands that they want to carve out. But I always want to go back to what the UN definition of Palestine is today. It's the full West Bank, the full Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem as it was in 1967.
So some would say, and in fact, I think Sam has alluded to this, that there has been de facto annexation for some time. This month in Newsweek, Aaron David Miller wrote of the distinct possibility, he wrote, that the war may already be lost. In other words, annexation is de facto on the ground. So Mae Cannon, you as the director of Churches for Middle East Peace are campaigning against annexation. You've already made that appeal, but isn't Israel simply going public and making official and permanent something that's already true on the ground? What's the difference between what's present today and what might be present or true in July?
Yeah, great question. And some of it is just a legal distinction. So right now, I started to say in the Jordan Valley, if you travel there, you'll see Israeli flags all over. It's Area C. You know, many Israelis even travel to those parts of the West Bank and don't know that they're in the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank. So there might not be a physical difference in some of those little places, specific geographic places, but there would be a huge legal difference. And I think that's what's really critical to talk about. Palestinians living in the West Bank are under Israeli military law. If a child throws a stone who's a Palestinian, they don't have the rights of a citizen because they're under military law. So they go to a military court. Many times children are arrested at the middle of the night. Whereas if a 14-year-old Jewish settler throws a stone who's in the West Bank, they have the protection of the civil law of Israel. So they have the right to have a parent present. They have all kinds of protections of civil law that don't extend to the Palestinians. And so in that regard, can people hear me? I see someone said they lost audio.
I'm seeing some messages that that your audio is not working. I don't know, Nicole, if there's, okay.
Okay, good. People can hear. Okay, I'll just keep going then. I did see the question, if the US is the main culprit, what are we supposed to do with it? And one of the things we talk about in terms of Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians is that this in the United States is a domestic issue. You often think of it as foreign policy, but when you look at how much money the US government has committed to funding Israel towards Israeli militarization, that the relationship between our two countries is so significant that we have a presidential election happening in the fall, and there's often a few very distinct issues that determine, the presidential candidates' standings, and Israel is one of the #1 issues in that regard. So this is a domestic issue, and the person who asked that question said none of this matters unless the U.S. Congress changes its perspective, and in many ways we agree, which is why this Churches Against Annexation, and then there's Evangelicals Against Annexation, is such an important advocacy campaign, because we need to let our elected officials know that annexation would be detrimental to the Palestinian people, that it would further entrench injustices that have already exist, and it's ultimately not in the best interest of Jewish Israelis as well, let alone US foreign policy. And so I was very pleased to see, the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, Biden, just announced, it was an article I saw, I think in Haaretz, today today or yesterday that annexation would be very problematic, which was quite, I mean, you know, in some ways, many people would say too little, too late, but on the other hand, it's a step in the right direction. And so in that regard, you know, we're inviting people to post on social media using the hashtag Churches Against Annexation or the hashtag Evangelicals Against Annexation. Then tag your elected members of Congress and tell them that you care about this issue, and advocate for our US congressional representatives to engage and to oppose annexation. And then the last thing I just would say, Bruce, I saw this question about the discipleship issue and the Jerusalem Post article, which we can post in the chat in a minute. In the Jerusalem Post, some Christian leaders said this is not a Christian issue. Can we talk about why it is? And I would say some of the people who were quoted in that Jerusalem Post or Haaretz article, I'm not sure which one specifically Jeff's talking about, said we have too many problems of our own to be able to pay attention to what's happening in Palestine, right? We have major racial injustice. We have major conflicts in our own backyards. And I would quote Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm not saying this to diminish in any way the realities of our domestic challenges, but he says injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so that's why I believe fundamentally it's a discipleship issue.
Thank you. So that is a nice segue to a broader political discussion we could have for a moment here. Heather Keaney, the reactions to this proposal of Netanyahu and his new government globally and even within Israel have been quite sort of consistently negative. There's opposition within Israel on the ground. We're not just talking about Palestinians, we're talking about Israelis. And around the globe, Germany, France, Britain, the EU have all opposed the plan. The King of Jordan is warning of consequences. Some worry that Hezbollah or Hamas may try to stir up a regional war. And interestingly, recently, 220 retired Israeli military personnel, commanders, generals, signed a full-page ad in a number of Israeli newspapers signaling that the annexation would be dangerous for Israel's security. Others, worry about Israel's status as a democracy. But all of this doesn't seem to be worrying Netanyahu. He seems to be moving forward. So given this international opposition, Heather Keaney, do you think that the international actors will do more than issue statements? Do you think there's a will out there to do anything beyond that? And what does Netanyahu hope to gain by moving now, by annexing territory in July or in the months to come?
Can you hear me, first of all, before I?
Yes,
Good.
perfectly.
I mean, I think politics is about timing, and I think Netanyahu has proven himself to be a very wily and experienced politician, so I think timing is everything. I think July is strategic. I think he's going for this before our presidential elections. So I would certainly want, hope that we can engage further with the conversation that Mae just addressed about, is this a domestic issue in the US? I would say it very much is. The fact that what happens in Israel follows the US presidential cycle says that it is very much our issue. So I think Netanyahu sees an ally in Trump and wants to make sure that this gets done on Trump's watch. I think he also sees, and I fear he may be correct, that the rest of the world is distracted and that this is controversial and illegal, but that European states are issuing statements, but do they have the political will in the time of COVID? Still the economic shadow, even if we get a vaccine for COVID, trying to rebuild economies. I think his calculation is that nobody is going to do anything. And my fear is that he's right. I don't see the international community coming together on this issue. I fear that it will be another South Africa, that this will go on and it will get worse and worse in the plight of the Palestinians in these isolated, effectively townships. I mean, Israel will look more and more like South Africa. until the international community is forced to engage once again. But again, it's Palestinians who will suffer in the meantime, is my fear, which again, I think brings it back to this idea of a US domestic issue, that this is a domestic issue. Trump is seeing this, and it's a Christian issue because it's evangelical support for Trump, that he sees that this is a key thing, that a part of this is to appease a base, as I understand it. And that he sees that evangelicals, or certain segments of the Christian population in the US, are bigger supporters of this than many Israelis. I mean, this is very much a US domestic issue. And so I feel like it's incumbent on Christians in the US to be engaged, because if we're not directly affected, even though it's our politics and our domestic agenda that's driving this, it's Palestinians who are going to bear the brunt. So how can we not engage with this when they don't have a vote?
So let's turn to one of those Palestinians, Sam Bahour. You recently called this a move or push for annexation another Israeli annexation, the 2020 version of annexation. So I'm curious if you want to expand on that a little bit, but then more generally, what does all this look like from Ramallah? I mean, most West Bank Palestinians do not live in the areas that are being proposed for annexation, maybe close by, but not in those areas. How will residents of Ramallah be affected if this goes through? And then let's talk about the Palestinian Authority, which has, let's admit it, a low credibility and weak support on the Palestinian street. So what options are available to the PA at this point? Are Palestinians even unified enough to mobilize some kind of effective response?
A lot to unpack. Let me make a couple statements just in reply to what I've heard. I actually believe this is a lose-lose scenario for Netanyahu. If he backs off, which I actually think it will, his bark is louder than his bite. Already yesterday, they're talking about him coming up with apologies of why it's not happening in the blame game. If he backs out, then the Palestinian side and all of those around the world who stood against annexation are going to claim victory. If he continues on track, which is very possible as well, and then he puts Israel in the precarious position of losing standing in the international community, in the legal community, in the diplomatic community, something that Palestinians have been trying to do in 40, 50 years of effort, he's going to do it in one sweeping move in the Jordan Valley. So it's a lose-lose for him, and he knows it. A lot of people think that he might use this platform to call for another election. Remember, Israel had 3 elections in 1 year, and he's facing 3 fraud and corruption charges. So he wants to stay out of jail. Having elections every 6 months is a way to keep him out of jail. I'm glad you mentioned the 220 Israeli security personnel that stood up publicly against annexation. Footnote here, not everyone who's against annexation is against it for the right reasons. For example, settlers, many of them don't want annexation. They don't want to see a Palestinian state at any cost, at any size. So we need to be clear about what being against annexation means. This is not about annexation. Yes, it's annexation in the headlines today. This conflict today is about ending Israeli military occupation in the state of Palestine. And the worst thing that we can do is to give Netanyahu a nice red herring that he created for us called annexation and forget the core of how to end this misery that we've been living. The emperor, if he moves forward, is now totally naked. First and foremost, places like European Union never ever talked about Israel in terms of sanctions. I don't think they're close to doing it, but they started the discussion because he's threatening annexation. Israeli apologists, many of them evangelical Christians, are stuck because they're seeing what the reality of this Trump plan means on the ground, which is perpetual conflict forever. I don't think any human being wants to see that happen. But most importantly, the threat of annexation, which has already happened, moved the Palestinians, moved the body, as Heather properly said, who doesn't have a chair at the table. It moved us to finally close the chapter of the Oslo Agreement. It moved people to start to mobilize. This was a paralyzed society up until a month ago. So I think there's some silver lining in moving forward in a constructive way. You mentioned a lot of people are not in the areas that are going to be annexed. Two things to say here. One is the Jordan Valley is our food basket. Take away our food basket, every single Palestinian is negatively affected. So let's keep that in mind. And I would use the analogy of Wall Street. Wall Street is far away from most Americans. If it collapsed, what's the big deal? They're not there. Every single American, I hope, has a pension plan linked to Wall Street somehow, some way. Your deposit in your bank is linked to Wall Street. So there's areas where you don't have to be physically present to have a great interest to make sure you do not collapse. How it's looking from Ramallah is different. I mean, first, we're not getting a clear reading because of COVID. People are not out in full force, so we're not interacting like we usually do. What we're seeing is that people it's a generational kind of gap. The younger generation is using this act of annexation to make the point that a Palestinian state cannot happen. And they tell people like me, Sam, you're dreaming. Okay, it's on the papers in the UN, but in reality, it will never happen. We only have one default endgame, and that is one state called Israel from the river to the sea, and we have to convert this into a civil rights movement and call for civil rights. I can argue that, but that's what one generational segment is talking about. The older generation, who maybe is more aware of what the PLO was all about and what two states was all about, and the long, hard effort to get to international recognition of not only our rights, but of our state, are more worried because they see that Israel's not interested in one state by any stretch of an imagination with equality. And they're definitely talking about not allowing a Palestinian state to emerge. So the more mature, I would say, generation politically is seeing this act of annexation as closing the chapter on an attempt to equitably solve this through negotiations. And that's, to me, the most dangerous part of this. Because if people lose hope that a conversation in international law and third parties getting involved is not going to resolve this, we are moving closer and closer to violence at levels that may have not been seen before. And if not now, for a very long time to come. And that's something I can't accept. So I will do everything I can to keep the focus on getting the Israeli occupation out of the state of Palestine, so both of these societies can start to rehabilitate and hopefully future generations learn how to live better together.
So Heather Keaney, it sounds like Sam is saying that even if the Palestinian Authority closed its doors, handed over the keys and said, you get everything, we're done. You can have security issues, but you can also run the schools, clean the sewers, make this entire territory between the river and the sea one thing, you get it, you win. That wouldn't work. That's not a solution that would be accepted. There would continue to be in the resulting single entity 2 tiers of people. There wouldn't be one equal status for all between the river and the sea. Is that fair to say?
So far, yes. I mean, I think one of the things that has been a huge learning curve for me in the last 10 years is learning more about the 2-tier system, as Sam pointed out, within the state of Israel itself, that it presents itself for all of its citizens as being a democracy because there are individual rights of assembly or freedom of religion. But what they don't address is that there's also, by claiming and emphasizing it's a Jewish state, Jewish citizens have a whole additional package of rights that they have as Jews. That's what it means to be a Jewish state. So all non-Jews do not have those same rights. So even if Israel absorbed everything, and even if they gave citizenship, right? So there's like several problems. One is they could form one state, but not grant citizenship. That's a disaster. Secondly, they could offer citizenship, but even now, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are second tier, different set of laws, different courts, not the same privileges, not the same rights to land, to access to water. They can't establish businesses in the same way. And all of that would potentially continue if Israel is to say, if this idea of a Jewish state that has meant and been translated into law as privileges for Jews, which means discrimination against non-Jews. I don't see a way to square that. And I think that's why Sam is saying more experienced generation of Palestinian activists see the one-state solution is not an easy solve to this problem.
Now the huge fear, as you well know, in Israel among Jewish Israelis is not only the security concerns, which I think the Israeli military more or less keeps under control, but the demographic threat, right? This is the big time bomb. The prospect in the minds of Israelis that all people would have a vote would soon transform the state into a minority Jewish population, and that's a real issue that is alive and existentially pressing in the minds of Jewish Israelis. That we do need to keep in mind as an additional complication here, notwithstanding what you've just said. Let me, with that though, turn to Mae Cannon and ask a different kind of question. Mae, you've already addressed this to a point, but this webinar is sponsored by the network of Evangelicals, the E word. About 80%, more or less, of evangelicals in America believe that God promised the Holy Land to the Jews and that promise still holds. These folks may even have celebrated this year when Donald Trump unveiled his deal of the century, his plan, his vision, that clearly, I think, favors Israel and even tacitly threatens the Palestinians if they fail to cooperate. Mae, imagine that you're in an elevator with Christians inclined to celebrate every inch of promised land that is under Israeli control. The elevator ride is short. What do you say?
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be a tough conversation. I hope it's a 100-story building and I have, maybe the elevator breaks down so I could have a few more minutes. But I have the privilege of leading a broadly ecumenical organization that has, Catholics, Orthodox, mainline Protestant, evangelical, peace churches, and Unitarian Universalists. So all that to say, there's a breadth of theological perspective for churches for Middle East peace. For myself, who I identify as an evangelical, I'm ordained in an evangelical denomination, I think it's critically important that we understand, I think it's absolutely possible to maintain a conservative theology and even to maintain what many conservatives believe, the Jews are God's chosen people, and yet within the construct of that own theological framework to understand that that doesn't justify confiscation of Palestinian land, the abuse of Palestinian people, the ongoing abuses of the occupation. So let's just say we're all conservatives, we all believe in the inerrant word of God. When you look at the covenant of God with the Jewish people in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, there were mandates for what the covenant relationship was supposed to look like. How are the Jews supposed to respond to the needs of their neighbor? When we look at Abraham and his wife Sarah died and was buried in Hebron, he didn't take the land. He paid for the actual place where the tomb of the patriarchs is, in Halil, Hebron today. Right? When David conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites, he went back and paid the Jebusite king for the land that he had conquered. So, this is not, our policies at CMEP or anything like that, but I think often the debate needs to be within the context of, for people who have a framework of saying the scriptures are the sacred text of God, let's really then look at what they say and let's look at what the Old Testament says, and we haven't even gotten to Jesus yet. who said, you know, the Old Testament says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you a whole different covenant that talks about not only loving your neighbor, but loving your enemy. So, I mean, we can make the argument through the teachings of Jesus all day long, but I would argue that with a conservative reading of the scriptures, we're mandated to love our Palestinian brothers and sisters who are not, what did you say earlier, Sam? You said, you know, sometimes we romanticize, you know, who are a people who are struggling, and there's a history of violence at times that needs to be rejected, and there's beautiful things, and you know, there's beautiful Palestinian culture and history, and there's aspects of the culture and history that also, you know, are in need of redemption, if you will, just as there are for any people group that exists. And so that would be my response to that question.
So one of the things you might have said on the elevator was that tomorrow there is another webinar sponsored again by the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. Can you see it there on your screen? It's
Yep.
The Bible and the Land of Promise, a Christian conversation. So in this webinar, the question is going to be posed to 4 biblical scholars, 2 of whom would self-identify as Christian Zionists and 2 of whom would not. And we're hoping to have a lively, engaging discussion between them about where evangelicals differ and how they see Israel's relationship and the Jews' relationship to the land differently. There will be hopefully lots of light and not too much heat in that conversation. There's another resource that on the elevator ride would have been good to point them to. Mae, do you want to say a little bit about the Advocacy Summit?
Sure. So all day on Monday, Monday the 22nd of June, so that's this coming up Monday, CMEP's doing our annual Advocacy Summit, so Churches for Middle East Peace. It will be a virtual summit, so we'd love it if you join us. There's a registration page there. We've got some great special guests. Jeremy Ben-Ami is the Executive Director of J Street, who'll be one of the keynote speakers. The other keynote speaker is Dima Khalidi, who is the Executive Director of Palestine Legal. She'll be talking about Palestinian human rights. We have some panels talking about how COVID has affected the broader Middle East. We'll have someone from Gaza with us, which we're very grateful for. And then at the end of the day, I'm not sure, it might be too late to sign up for the advocacy groups, but the information would be on the website. The idea is that this is a day that will give us information that we can then use in our advocacy as we reach out to our elected officials.
So thanks for that commercial to sneak in there. We have 5 minutes before Zoom is going to kick us off the air. There have been some questions come in that we've addressed. Before we look to just a few remaining questions from viewers, Heather and Sam, do either of you want to specifically address the evangelical American community to tag on to what Mae was just saying in terms of what your word would be, your challenge, your call, invitation?
Sure. I think, I don't know if I'm on, but
Yep.
I think, as I said before, we are not bystanders of this conflict. We are active participants, and it's in part because of evangelical support that things are in the situation that they are, that the support that we give to our policies here. I think we're challenged by what does it mean to be children of the kingdom of God and children of US and US foreign policy. And I feel like those are in tension, but I feel like our ultimate loyalty should be to the kingdom of God. And I think the principles of that kingdom are clear. And as Mae said, the Palestinians are our brothers and sisters. They are deserving of full equality and protection. And for better or worse, that rests surprisingly in our hands. And I think our voting and our advocacy and our donor money affects their lives. And therefore we have to handle that responsibly and in a way that is honoring to God.
Sam Bahour, as you take a final word, I'll just tag on a question that came up in the Q&A that goes back to where we began, and that is the 90s and the Oslo process. So the questioner is asking, is Oslo basically over? Is it even relevant? Do we need to start from scratch? That's something you've sort of addressed, but maybe reflect on that and then offer a final thought, if you will, to your viewers.
Sure. In terms of the evangelical community, I actually want to just speak briefly about my own personal experience. I've received many evangelical groups from the US, mainly they come from Telos Group, who brings them here. And I can tell you from my experience, and I have about 20 years of speaking to groups coming through here, when evangelicals who are deeply emotionally involved in this, and that's okay, when they see reality for what it is, that's what it takes for them to rethink their political positions. And I say that in terms of, I don't know what the future endgame looks like, and I don't think anybody here or on this call is going to be able to define that. I think we need to separate some kind of political endgame and talk also about the here and now, which is a rights discussion. And when people see the violations that are happening in our lives, they take a step back and they say, what? We didn't know what that occupation meant in a day-to-day way. We didn't know that we're funding this and supporting it and covering up for it. And evangelicals, more than anyone else, maybe equally Jewish American groups that come, when they see the reality, at core, we share the same values. And they are tipped off that that's happening without their knowledge, and they go back and educate themselves.
Let me seize the microphone as our last 60 seconds unfolds here. That's a great note to end on. A note to say, come to the land and see for yourselves. Unfortunately, a lot of us can't right now, but as soon as we can, we will. And thank you for that invitation. And we look forward to continuing conversations on the ground in Israel, Palestine, but also here we are on the web. So thank you all for your participation. Thanks to our panelists and to our guests. We hope we answered some questions, and we hope we raised even more. Stay safe and be well. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks, Mae.
Sure.